city burned to the ground, so they started living in tents. What is fascinating about this era is for the first 100 years of the city, the social contract was such that if you didn't have a home, it was entirely appropriate to live in a tent or a shanty at the edge of town. These people are along Burrard Inlet. There was a very large camp on the False Creek Flats. In fact, during the Depression, there were more than 500 people living on the False Creek Flats. There were more or less permanent camps in Richmond, in Burnaby, in North Vancouver. It was a simple idea. If you couldn't afford a house, you moved to the edge of town and set up a tent. And it worked to some degree. Meanwhile, some of the richest people in the world stayed downtown. This is the Balmoral Hotel. At that time, when these hotels were founded, Vancouver was Vegas. Rich business people who took the train all the way across the country and got on Empress steamers to travel across the ocean to their business interests in the Far East would spend a night or two in Vancouver. They went to top-end shows, top-end plays. And so you had this dynamic where the wealthiest, most successful, most on-the-go were in the city, and the poor were living in tents at the edge of the city. As most of you know, that has changed. The Balmoral was no longer that same kind of hotel.
The mint on your pillow moves.
At the museum, it's really fun to think about this cultural trend, too. So in World War II, most of the ships, those Empress steamers, were put into troop service use, and they never came back to service. So the purpose of the waterfront as a transfer station went away. At the same time, people started to fly. And so these hotels had no purpose being down near those piers, and they quickly felt empty. And the other thing that happened at the same time was we started paying welfare in about the 50s and 60s. And so these rooms became cheap. They became easy to afford. And the phrase single room occupancy, or SRO, came to be. And the key thing was welfare paid for rent. So those same people, or the same types of people who lived on the mud flats, who lived in False Creek, could now collect a welfare check and easily afford a hotel room. There were more than 10,000 rooms available by the 50s. And very quickly in Vancouver, there was almost no street homelessness. What we had was kind of a big flip. Initially, downtown was the place for the swells, and the homeless lived in North Van and Richmond. Then we wanted to build suburbs in North Van and Richmond and on the waterfront. And it was no longer okay for us to have homeless there, but the homeless could move downtown. So the homeless moved downtown, and the swells moved to the gleaming new suburbs. The SRO rooms, these hotel rooms, concealed our social problems for decades. During the 70s, there was quite an influx of heroin here, I'm told. There was the beginning of the decommissioning of Riverview, which continued for the next couple of decades. But as people needed places to stay, it was always possible for another landlord to open more rooms at a hotel or open another hotel. In the 80s, cocaine contributed to the problem, and the displacement of Expo 86 contributed to the problem, but there were still more empty hotels to reopen, and they were still renting for less than the welfare rate. In the 90s, it stepped up with crack and meth, but the hotels still had room. So we had all of these social problems in Vancouver, but we didn't see them on the street the way we do today because it was hidden inside. Unfortunately, we also didn't treat it. We just put it away in these rooms. In 1970, the city estimate shows 10,000 or more SRO rooms in the downtown east side. By 2005, that number dropped in half to 5,000, and an estimate by the Carnegie Group in 2009 puts the number at about 3,600. Now, I'm not saying, and I want to be clear, that the disappearing hotel room is the only cause of homelessness in Vancouver. We looked earlier at why homeless people think they're out in the streets, and they named poverty and addiction and family problems as their causes. But if you want to understand why the problem kind of ballooned and exploded, and we saw them so suddenly in the last decade, I think these numbers give you a pretty good clue to what happened in Vancouver. And they created a new situation. This is an encampment in Oppenheimer Park. If you can't find a room, you go back to camping. However, we've also decided that camping is illegal. We've started cracking down on camping in Vancouver, and most notoriously, they cracked down on camping in Victoria, and some of the campers there took the case to court, making the obvious argument. If you don't have rooms for us that we can afford, and we can't camp, what do you expect us to do? And the BC Supreme Court about a year ago agreed that the Victoria camping bylaw was illegal, which leaves the whole question of camping in a kind of legal limbo for the time being. Vancouver, Victoria, and other cities continue to play whack-a-mole with campers, trying to round them up as much as they can and hope not to go to court again. But it leaves us with a question I hope to think about tonight as you head upstairs. If the people on the streets of Vancouver and BC's other cities can't get housing, and they can't camp, what do we expect them to do? So the other thing we've done at the Tyee is look around at what's worked other places. And the results were really interesting, at least for me. This is one of my favorite photos, by the way. This is from the new Hope in Shadows calendar, which comes out on Tuesday. I'm a huge fan of Hope in Shadows, and I hope you'll buy not just one, but extras for your friends when it comes out on Tuesday this week. Most of these previous images were from previous calendars. 3 elements of what works: housing first, treatment at home, and community support. And we're going to talk about each of these for a few minutes. Housing first. What is housing first? Housing first means you get a room. You get one of those SRO rooms. You have your own sink. This photo is actually, again, of someone who had been homeless, who's able to start cooking. It's not a glamorous meal she's making in her restaurant sink, but it's a lot different having a sink than not having a sink. People who live indoors, only live indoors, have better health, they live longer, more seek treatment, there are far fewer police calls, and far less time in hospital. This housing first model works so well. This is the model that's been used in New York and London and many other cities to reduce their homelessness. Now, does this sound familiar? If we've just talked about the history in Vancouver for all this time, it occurs to us that housing first is really just what we were already doing in Vancouver from the 40s to the 90s. We didn't give it the fancy name, but we were practicing it. And as we remember, homelessness costs about $100,000 a year. Housing costs $37,000 a year. When I mentioned some of these numbers to my friend Sundance, who we saw at the beginning of this, he said something along the lines of, "This ain't rocket surgery." All right. So there's 3 elements of what works. First is housing. The next is recovery and treatment. So let's talk for a minute about what needs treating. And again, instead of deciding ourselves, let's ask the homeless themselves. In the survey a year ago, 61% of the people on the street said they were addicted and had problems with addiction. 46% said they had medical conditions. 33% said they were struggling with mental illness. And 31% cited physical disabilities as part of their health problems. So when we talk about treatment at home, this is what we're talking about treatment. And the bottom line is, nobody gets better from any of those things while homeless. No one kicks their habits on the street. No one improves their physical health or their mental health while living on the street. There simply is not treatment without housing. I mean, and it's obvious, right? But it's important to focus on for a minute. So, if you want to get treatment today, the way the system works, here's what you're probably going to face. And let's start, because they mentioned addiction was their main problem. Let's start with detox. You want to get into detox. What you're asked to do here is call a phone number and get on a list. And if you don't have a phone, and you may not have a quarter, but you need to call a phone number and get on a list. And if you don't get in that day, you need to call the next day and the next day. And you're expected to call every day and keep your name on the top of the list. And if you don't call, your name slips down the list. That barrier alone, believe it or not, prohibits a lot of mentally distressed, addicted people from getting into detox.